And I was particularly impressed by how much you can cover conceptually and empirically, like 500 years of colonial history, and all these, graphs, as you showed, about economic losses, to create a very, I know, something that's very ambitious, very wide scale, like climate changes, but also very concrete and illuminating. So I think it was, yeah, very interesting way of working with data. It also showed what you can do with data that's publicly available, and also how you can bring together different kinds of language, in a way, like the language of economics and finance with the language of justice and reparations and colonialism and enslavement. And so I think this is really important work, and really needs to be brought out more, I think, into the public debates. I mean, really, I guess I just have a few comments or questions that we could prompt the discussion further. Things I wanted to know more about, and some sort of burning questions I had towards the end. One of the questions I guess I had is about the tension, in a way, between the different kinds of data. So is there a risk, for example, in putting things in monetary terms, in calculating all the losses in that way, in kind of, yeah, I guess the framing around financial loss? So there's great benefits in a way to be able to show that and to make a case, but is there also a risk? And I thought that was a sort of an interesting but challenging political question as to what next. So in a way, I guess another way of saying that is all this is out there in the public domain. Those tables are produced, and people, probably a lot of people know these, I guess, maybe if not the specific figures, but it's, been there and in the debates, although obviously very sidelined in the climate talks. But what does knowing about it help in terms of the political process? I think it's absolutely right and important to think about reparations and this idea of that as a gaping hole in terms of the processes and what needs to happen. But then you also point out in the figures that that's just not happening. And so how do you make it happen is, I guess, the practical question. So although it's practical in some levels in terms of the figures, the things we know, how can you get the kind of political will or the set of stakeholders involved, the governments to listen, if all of this has been happening for so long, if there's these vested interests? So those are the kinds of questions I had, and I guess a few smaller points, and then you can respond and open up to others, are around a few things you sort of mentioned in passing that I thought would be interesting to know more about. One was about how climate finance has become more neoliberal, and it's a neoliberal tool. And you talked about, in your slides later, you talked about how climate finance focuses more on mitigation rather than on adaptation. But I wanted to know if there's actually what some of the practical, on the ground examples are of climate finance maybe operating in countries in the Caribbean or other parts of more vulnerable countries that are destructive in and of themselves. So, because I found that a very fascinating, disturbing, but sort of interesting and fascinating development as well. The idea that corporations can still make money through climate finance, and what seem like the solutions are actually part of the problem. So yeah, maybe I'll just leave it there, because that's a lot to take on board, and maybe come up with some other thoughts later in the discussion. If that's okay. Keston, are you there?
Yes, I am
Yeah,
here.
okay, yeah. Did you want to respond first to that, and then we can
Yeah,
open it
sure.
out to some questions?
Sure. Thank you for these comments and interrogative questions. I think it's definitely some things that I am thinking about in my own work or beginning to think about as well. Um, and I think they're very, very relevant to dissect both politically and intellectually some of these concerns around neoliberalism and how you can actually quantify the quantification of losses and so on with respect to climate change. Um, I think first up, yes, there is definitely a tension, and I think um, the tension has to do with um, around it's methodological but also political. Methodological in the sense that there are certain kinds of ideas that are embedded in these data and embedded in these figures to arrive at what it costs for a community that is completely wiped out, for instance. There are also supposedly ethical considerations that we need to think about um, around quantifying those kinds of losses, and how do we make space in a sense for communities to think about what this means beyond simple numbers and data. So I am very, very attuned to that important consideration. So there is definitely a point to be made there. But I think there's also a subversive element to it, right? And I mean that by saying that I'm utilizing the very data that you're putting out there around these questions and interpreting them in a very different kind of way, right? And that is I think that is how we can utilize data on one end. But I also am interested in picking apart much of this data, and I'm planning to do some work on that on terms of what are the methodological considerations and sort of epistemic and ideological underpinnings of some of these data that I think are very critical for making the argument around what can we actually quantify in terms of reparations, but in terms of the losses and damage that communities and peoples face as a result of climate change. I think that might take it account the first point. Yes, there is definitely um, a political consideration around, um, how do we implement or how do we even bring to the table the question of reparations and climate reparations in that regard, um, in the sense that um, it is not something being discussed right now in public debates, as far as I know, to the degree that countries are thinking about this. So, we have certain groups, sort of left-leaning groups in both in the UK and the US, talking about a Green New Deal and what that might mean in terms of a green recovery for those countries. But at a sort of at the level of climate politics, at the level of global climate politics, um, I think I don't take credit for bringing the discussion around climate reparations to the fore. That actually that is due to uh, social movements and those groups, especially from the global south, that brought those discussions to the United Nations and other international and multilateral fora. And the issue has been both framed around ecological debt and climate debt. So I think much of that has continued, the kinds of political mobilization, or what we saw that, I think, was it last year or year before in Madrid at the COP 20, what was it? I can't remember. The COP, the Conference of Parties meeting, where from reports that I've read, they were talking about loss and damage. There were a number of movements bringing that to the fore. And I think we need to, at the end, I talked about the fact that we need to break out of the current nationalistic discussions around climate change. And I think that is happening a lot now in the United States. Even with the new president having taken office for the last 10 days, there's a discussion around climate change being a national concern and not one that is global in orientation. And what do we need to do at a global level to build up the political capital, to put it in that sense, to confront these kinds of the vested interests, fossil fuel companies, investors and institutional investors that are investing in climate-related projects, to put it that way. And lastly, I think, there is definitely a challenge to with respect to climate finance. So there's serious contradictions in climate finance in terms of how it's quantified, but in terms of how it's sort of distributed. So a lot of the discussion in literature have focused on development aid or climate finance being part of development aid and current streams of sort of aid. That has its own problems by itself. So it's not, direct support for climate projects per se, but it's actually already part of extractive development aid projects and development aid industrial complex, if we want to call it that. Yes, and in Haiti, I think there is, and some Caribbean countries, there are very harmful effects to these kinds of financing. And I experienced this directly in Haiti as I was there on a project a couple of years ago where we were setting up, I suppose, infrastructures around Haiti accessing global climate finance. And one, it is very alienating from communities at one level and very centralized in terms of government operations, in terms of Haiti. So financing do not, on one level, go to communities, but often centralized and often subject to the kinds of political economy situation there. Second, when there is financing, it is often centered on the institution or organization that is delivering supposedly that aid, through consultants being hired and high salaries for relief workers and so on and so on and so on. And often there's a democratic deficit, as Norman Govan would talk about it in a different context. He talks about it, but there's a democratic deficit in terms of meeting the needs of people on one end and meeting their everyday needs, and not sort of providing new opportunities for corporations to profit from those kinds of situations. So communities don't have democratic control over what financing they receive, but also over what projects can be pursued as a result of the financing that trickles down eventually to them. So yeah, I think that's what I'm going to say in response. So those were very thought provoking, and I think it's definitely things that I'm going to take on board in terms of carrying forward some of my own research.
Great. Well, thanks very much for your very thoughtful response. I love the idea of the subversive use of data. I think that, if you haven't already written that, you should use that. And I also like the idea that you're pushing forward with, other forms of, thinking about how these figures are created and the assumptions behind it. Because in some ways, the subversive use of data, that's like a sort of a small, just a tiny perspective of in terms of the larger set of debt, that is entailed. So it's like a drop in the bucket, even by their own terms, in a way. So yeah, it's great work.